Thank you very much, Olivia, and welcome to everybody this evening to this virtual visit of the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge. So let me start sharing my slides. There we go. So this evening I'm going to tell you the story of this refuge, which exists here peacefully and quietly and is unknown to a lot of the residents in this area and is, I think, not even fully appreciated by many of the residents who do know about it. So I'm going to explain, along with a lot of the history, about how this refuge has and still does come to the rescue, not only of wildlife, but of us as well. So I'm going to start the process by talking a little bit about the National Wildlife Refuge System and about Don Edwards as it exists today. So this slide shows the National Wildlife Refuge System, a collection of over 560 national wildlife refuges in the United States. They are administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is part of the Department of the Interior, which is the department which also has organizations such as the National Park Service and the U.S. Geological Survey. So in addition to administering the refuges, they are also owned by the federal government. So they are public lands where appropriate, available to all of us. So why do we have national wildlife refuges and what is it that they do? Well, their major mission is to protect habitats, to conserve America's wildlife, both plants and animals. And that is the #1 overriding goal. As part of that, there's a special emphasis on threatened and endangered species of both plants and animals. And the presence of one or more endangered species is one of the major motivating factors for creating a national wildlife refuge. Secondly, where it's consistent with that mission, there's also access to these public lands and waters. So as you'll see when I talk about the refuges in the area, some of them, like Don Edwards, are open to the public. Others of them are not. Where it is possible, we conduct environmental education and interpretation programs such as this one. And we provide what we call wildlife-oriented recreation. So that's low-key recreation, hiking, biking, photography is very popular, wildlife watching, mostly birds in the case of Don Edwards. And in some cases, again, where it's consistent, hunting and fishing is also allowed. This slide has a number of pictures from Don Edwards. The two on the left are some of the birds that frequent the refuge. The birds on the upper part, those are double-breasted cormorants, and they have spread their wings out because they need to dry the wings off. Cormorants are deep diving birds and their wings get very wet from their prolonged stays underwater, and they have to dry them off before they can go diving again. At the bottom, you see some American white pelicans in the foreground and American avocets in the background. And this gives you a little idea of how valuable it is and the number of birds that we attract to the refuge. At the top center is one of our education programs. It is a recent visit by 6th graders to our facility in Fremont, and they are standing in an overlook and the ranger is describing what it is they're seeing and the parts of the refuge as an introduction to the refuge. Below that is one of our biologists who is doing a measurement of one of the endangered species that we have at Don Edwards, a mouse actually, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then finally is a picture of one of our employees, Miguel, who came to the refuge to celebrate a birthday party. And you don't have to be an employee to celebrate. Anybody can come to Don Edwards and the other open refuges and have a party as long as you follow the rules, which are basically, number one, don't disturb anything. And number two, make sure you take out everything that you have brought in with you. So in the Bay Area, there are 7 national wildlife refuges. And this is the greater Bay Area because 2 of them are down by Monterey Bay. And you see them here with San Pablo Bay to the north, all the way down to Salinas River in the south. And of the 7, 3 of them, San Pablo Bay, Don Edwards, and Salinas River are open to the public. And they are open to the public every day, except for the major holidays of Thanksgiving, Christmas Day, and New Year's Day. The other ones are smaller refuges, and they just don't have the ability to have the public visit. They're small and sensitive environments, and there's no facility for hiking or anything like that. So those are closed to the public, and they focus on protection of wildlife. So here is a map of Don Edwards, and let me explain it a bit. The boundaries of the refuge are shown outlined by the dark green lines. So you see it as kind of a patchwork of areas that have been put together over the last 50 years that are now part of the refuge. There are other protected areas here in the South Bay, and they're under different jurisdictions, so they're not part of the federal refuge. The colors show the type of land, and the green and blue colors are natural lands, much as they were originally around the bay. The orange colors are salt ponds, and we'll talk more about that, but just quickly, a salt pond is an area of the edge of the bay, which is privately owned, and the salt pond is surrounded by a levee. And to simplify it a little bit, the water essentially from the bay is let into the salt pond, and it is let stand there, and it evaporates, leaving salt, which can then be harvested. And then the cycle goes on again. So we'll talk more about that later. The 16 numbers on the map are the 16 trails that are available within the refuge. So there is a wide geographic dispersal and a wide variety of trails. The trails numbered 1, 2, and 5 are at our Fremont location, where you saw the photograph on the previous slide. And that is the administrative headquarters for this refuge and for the refuge complex. The trails number 8, 9, and 10 are in a facility we have in El Viso called the Environmental Education Center. And those are the trails in that area. But as I will talk about later, that area is now undergoing a restoration and enhancement project. Some of those trails are closed on a temporary basis, but overall the area is open and available to visitation. So the last point I will make, which is pretty obvious there, is the National Wildlife Refuge is located here in this urban area in the southern part of the San Francisco Bay Area. And this was one of the first refuges to be created in an urban area. Typically, before this, refuges were out in the wilderness or the prairie or the desert or someplace pretty far from where a lot of people were. And yet here's this refuge here surrounding the South Bay. So it's very convenient for those of us who live in the area to visit for a day, for a half a day, even for a lunch hour if you happen to be close enough to part of the refuge. So I think from that perspective, we're very fortunate to have the refuge here. So now I'm going to get to the main part of this presentation, talking about why and how the refuge has come to the rescue, both to wildlife and to us. But in order to do that, we need to understand what has happened to the bay over the last 170 years. And just as important, what did not happen to the bay. And in order to understand that, we need to go back and talk about what the bay was before the Western settlers came into this area and how the bay formed. So let's ask the question, why is San Francisco Bay here? And why does it have what is a very unique situation and shape? And my answer to that is it's the fault's fault. The San Francisco Bay is located between two major faults, the San Andreas Fault to the west and the Hayward Fault to the east. So the bay fills a natural depression that formed between those two faults eons ago. The San Andreas Fault is the fault that marks the delineation between the Pacific Plate on the west side and the North American Plate on the east side. So it's a major fault, and it even has its own website. And Olivia will put the link for the website on the chat if you're interested in finding out more about San Andreas Fault. So this depression has existed for many millennia. And over this geological time of tens and hundreds of thousands of years, the Earth has cooled and warmed and cooled and warmed periodically. And as the water level fell and rose, the bay correspondingly filled and emptied out. And if we go back to about 10,000 years ago, the end of the last ice age, the water level was low because much of the Earth's water was solid ice as glaciers over the landmass. And San Francisco Bay was not a bay, it was a valley. And it was full of plants and animals and even some human beings. But starting then and for about the next 3,000 years, the Earth warmed up, the ice melted, and the bay began to fill up. The bay filled from the west through the Golden Gate with water from the Pacific Ocean, and from the east with fresh water that came down from melting snow and ice in the Sierra Nevada. So this is both fresh water and salt water that is in the bay. And that means that the bay is what's called an estuary. That is, it is a mixture of fresh water and salt water. That's the definition of an estuary. So that makes San Francisco Bay a very special environment. And the fact that it's an estuary combined with the very mild climate here means it's a very productive and abundant ecological area. So let's talk a little bit about the bay as it was before the European settlement, which I'll consider the bulk of the settlement starting around 1848, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So if we could look down at the bay and see what it looked like, we would notice that at that time, it was 50% larger in surface area than the bay is today. And we couldn't notice by looking at it, but we might find out that it was also a lot deeper than it is today. And we will discuss the reasons for that transition in this presentation as we go through history. And part of the reason for that difference is the fact of the um, geology of the bay, that the bottom of the bay rises very gradually from the center as it rises, and eventually the land meets the hills on either side. And so what that means is the water line at low tide and the water line at high tide are very far apart. In many places, they are a mile or 2 miles apart. And this area then forms what we call a tidal marsh. And those marshes were considered part of the bay and existed extensively up until the middle of the 19th century and have been destroyed in large part since then, which is what we're going to talk about. So that's one major reason for the shrinking of the bay. And we'll talk about tidal marshes on the next slide. But meanwhile, the bay, as it filled up and as the area developed, filled with fish and crustaceans and marine mammals. There used to be sea otters here in the bay. There used to be sea lions in the bay. A very large number of marine species. Also, the land around the bay was populated with animals that are no longer here, like antelope and elk, as well as grizzly bears and mountain lions, some of which are still here. And as I pointed out earlier, the area was used for millions, literally millions of birds every year, both birds that were native and lived in this area and birds that were passing through when they were migrating from north to south or in the other direction. And as Olivia mentioned earlier, this area was settled by the Native Americans about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. And they lived in the area and utilized the resources of the bay and the surrounding area for them to live. So we'll talk a little bit more about tidal marshes. This is a contemporary picture of a marsh. It is at pretty much at full tide. So on the right-hand side, you see some land with plants, but you can also see that there's water spreading over the land. So that land is inundated at high tide. But as the tide goes out, that water will recede and the land will be exposed. So that's really the nature of most of a marsh. And those plants are adapted to living in soil that is wet just about all the time. In the center is a channel of water. That's a channel of water that has extended in from the bay and extended inland through the marsh. And the name for that kind of a channel is a slough, S-L-O-U-G-H. And so the slough is connected to the bay, and therefore the water level will rise and fall with the tide. So here at high tide, it's pretty full, and it will be a source of food for fish like ducks and similar birds that will actually come and swim in the water and hunt for fish or plants or whatever it is that is their diet. As the tide goes out, that water will recede and the mud is exposed. And in the mud live a lot of creatures like snails and worms and crabs, and other kinds of birds will come into the dry slough or the waterless slough, and they will hunt for food as well. So this is a very diverse environment supporting a lot of different kinds of birds. And then over on the right and in the foreground, you see some land that pretty much stays dry most of the time, except perhaps for very high tides. And there are plants that grow in that area. And as you get a little further away, there are some larger plants as well. So that's what tidal marshes look like. And that's what most of San Francisco Bay was surrounded by before the settlers came in and the area became populated. So let's talk about why these marshes are important, both over time and in some ways more especially today. Um, they are a home for endangered species. I talked about the mouse briefly. Many animals that lived in the marshes were very common when marshes were surrounding the bay. But now that most of the marshes have been destroyed, those animals are endangered. And again, I'll talk about two of them that are in Don Edwards when we get towards the end of the presentation. It's a sanctuary for other wildlife, such as bird life. And it's a place where the bottom of the food chain exists. So these marshes and the waterways have a lot of plankton, both plant plankton, which are phytoplankton, and microscopic animal plankton, which are zooplankton. And the plants, of course, are part of the plant life that provides oxygen for us. And the plants are eaten by some of the animals, which are in turn eaten by other animals, and so, until they get to birds and fish that we would recognize. And then those animals are eaten by, often by mammals, such as us. So if there weren't places for the bottom of the food chain, such as tidal marshes, then there would be problems with those of us that are higher in the food chain as well. So the marshes are very important for supporting the food that we eat and the oxygen that we breathe. The marsh provides shelter and protection. As I said, plants, both the phytoplankton and the more visible plants that you saw in the photograph, absorb carbon dioxide and emit oxygen, as all plants do. And the fact that there is so much plant life in these marshes means that they are just as effective in that as a rainforest. We tend to learn about rainforests and how important they are for the survival of all of us here on Earth. And we don't tend to learn as much about wetlands like marshes, but they too are critical for the production of the oxygen that all of us need. Marshes can act like a sponge. So when there are very high tides or when there are storms, marshes will absorb a lot of that water. That's important to us today because we as a species like to settle around water, right? We settled around San Francisco Bay. Big cities are built on rivers. And so it's important to have protection from floods. And marshes, when they are existing, will help protect the land that is just outside the marsh area. Marshes also clean water that comes through it. So when the marsh is in a valley and in a bay, such as San Francisco Bay, the water will flow down out of the hillsides and make its way into the bay. And this water will contain natural dirt and debris, but being that this is a heavily settled area, it will also contain soap and other chemicals. And when it passes through the marsh, all of that pollution, in effect, or a lot of it, will get caught in the marsh and trapped in the marsh until it can decompose. And so it will not pass into San Francisco Bay. And finally, where we're able to, we open up the marshes for recreation and relaxation, as I talked about in the case of Don Edwards. This can't happen with just a pure natural marsh. There's really no way for us to hike through a marsh. But where we can, we build boardwalks or we repurpose levees that were built for salt ponds or other purposes that now can support hiking and biking and so on and so forth. So it becomes a recreational area for us, as well as all the other things that we do. So this is kind of the background for me to start talking about what happened to the bay since the settlers came. And the way I like to talk about it is break up these periods into paths. So we're going to talk about the path of recognition and exploitation. So the Western Europeans recognized San Francisco Bay in 1769 and then began to settle it and exploit it. And we'll talk about that. Starting in 1848, a year you may recognize, although more commonly it's mentioned as 1849 for the start of the gold rush, was a path to riches for some people and prosperity, but also despoilment of the environment. And that's very important, and we'll talk about that. After 1884, mining was no longer done in this part of California, or not done extensively, but there was a growing population in the area and industrialization. So we had more exploitation of the natural resources in the area. And in addition to all of that, we polluted the bay. And that occurred ever since the bulk of the settlers came here, and occurred up until the 1960s. So we'll talk about all of those paths. And we'll talk about a path that we didn't take, which is very important, but I think very important for us to learn about as well. And that was the path of destruction. And I think you will be surprised, as I have been surprised, with the fact that the kinds of plans that there were for literal destruction of the bay. So let's go to the first path. The path, excuse me, I'm just adjusting my screen. The first path of recognition and exploitation. So the Spanish in Mexico had explored by sea the area of what is now the Western United States. And they had ships going up and down the coast. And so they were familiar with the coast, but they did not know about the Golden Gate as an entrance to San Francisco Bay. This is because of the extensive fog in the area, the fact that no one was really looking for something like that, and the fact that the shoreline in the area of the Golden Gate is very rocky. And these were sailing ships. And so they had every motivation to stay pretty far from the shore to avoid a freak wind coming up and the ship being blown into the rocky coast. But by 1769, the Spanish decided that they wanted to create a settlement at Monterey Bay, which they knew about by sea, but they didn't know exactly how to get there and where it was if they traveled by land. So there was an expedition that year led by Gaspar de Portela, and he came up the coast with a large expedition, and he found Monterey Bay. But due to some historical freaky circumstances that I unfortunately don't have time to talk about today, he didn't recognize that he had found Monterey Bay. And so he continued up north and found San Francisco Bay, which of course wasn't called that at the time, but that's the terminology I'll use. He knew that wasn't Monterey Bay and he wasn't very interested in it. So he turned around and went back. But the Spanish continued to explore the area. And in 1770, they did build a settlement in Monterey. And then a few years later, in 1776, they established a settlement in San Francisco, which they then called Yerba Buena. And they set up the Presidio and the Mission, both of which still exist today, although the Presidio is now a park and the Mission is still a church. So the Spanish didn't do a lot with the area. They set up the string of missions along the coast, all the way up to San Rafael, but they didn't really extensively settle the area or do anything with the area. But that changed after 1871, when Mexico won its independence from Spain. And now Mexico as a country had to support itself. And they figured out, hey, we've got all this land in what is now the southwestern United States. We need to start using it. Excuse me. And so they set up a bunch of cattle ranches. They took the land and they divvied it up into very large parcels of thousands of acres. And they gave those out to people who would become ranchers. And they called those areas ranchos. And the owners of the ranches brought in cattle and other farm areas, other farm animals from Spain, and they brought in grasses and other plants that those animals ate, and they began transforming the area to be suitable for farming. And in some places, they looked at the tidal marshes and said, hey, you know, we could fill that in and create even more land for grazing. And so they did. And so began the beginning of the elimination of some of the tidal marshes around the bay. So that era ended in 1848, when two things happened. First of all, that was the end of the Mexican-American War in early 1848. And so that meant that all of the land that today we call Southwestern United States passed from Mexico to become a territory of the United States. And only 2.5 years later, then California was admitted to the Union as a state. But more importantly, from an environmental point of view, the gold was discovered in early 1848 by James Marshall at Sutter's Mill. And that has had a very profound effect on the environment. So our picture of the gold rush, which, as I mentioned, really started in 1848 when the people in the local area learned about gold. But it took a while for the news to get to the East Coast of the United States and then to Europe. And so it wasn't until 1849 that the vast majority of people, the hordes of people, started coming into San Francisco and then going up to the Sierra Nevada to try to make their fortune. So we typically say that the gold rush was 1849. Technically, it began in 1848, but nonetheless, the first few years of the gold rush were much like the picture that we see there at the upper left, with individual prospectors or small groups of prospectors panning for gold in the rivers and streams, or looking for gold pebbles on land, and so on and so forth. That was what I call the easy gold. And that gold was essentially gone in 2 or 3 years. And that forced these individual prospectors to either go somewhere else to look for gold, to go to San Francisco and live in the area, or to get a ship and go back to wherever they came from. But there was still a lot of gold in the soil in the Sierra Nevada, but it was in very fine particles and it was mixed in with the soil. So it could not be captured by prospecting or someone with a pickaxe. What it took was a lot more effort, and that was done by corporations who had the resources to gather men and equipment that they could use to get the gold. And the way they did that is shown in that central picture called hydraulic mining. To summarize, that mining has several steps. First of all, clearing the plant life off of a hillside. Second of all, using water jets to wash the soil down and mix the soil in with water, which would then flow away from the hillside. Then they would mix mercury with that soil to help separate the gold. And I'll talk about how that works in a minute. Then they wound up with the mercury and gold combination separate from all the water. So they got rid of all the water and all the excess soil, and they separated the gold and the mercury, and they wound up with pure gold. So this was the process that went on from the 1850s until 1884. So let me describe part of that a little bit more closely. I mentioned that they used mercury. So mercury, as is pictured there, is a metal at room temperature. It's silver, is a metal, yes, but is a liquid at room temperature is what I meant to say, and is silver colored, and you see it at the top. And mercury has the property of combining with gold, and simply mixing mercury and gold creates an alloy or a combination, and that alloy is called an amalgam when the alloy contains mercury, as we are talking about in this case. And so the mercury and the gold would clump up and form heavy pebbles, and that would settle out of that stream of water, and that could be captured. Now, mercury, since it is a liquid, doesn't take too much heat to actually cause it to boil off and vaporize. So that amalgam can be heated without too much difficulty. The mercury escapes as a gas and can be recaptured. And what's left is the pure gold, which is then sold, the whole purpose of the mining. So that was this process. And you may ask, where did the mercury come from? And as it turned out, there was a very rich source of mercury in the hills along the California coast. In fact, this was known already before the gold rush, because mercury is also used in the process of mining silver, as we'll talk about in a minute. And the Spanish had been mining silver for a long time, both in Spain and in Southern America. And so they used the mercury as part of the silver mining process. But this demand for mercury from the gold mining was much greater than demand from the silver mining at the time. And this spurred the creation of many more mines. So those red dots in the map actually are, each one is an individual mine, because anybody who owned land could start digging it up and mining the mercury. All those ranchos could take part of the thousands of acres and turn them into a mercury mine. So in the ground, mercury exists as a mineral, a reddish powdery mineral called cinnabar. And that mineral can be heated up. And again, it doesn't have to be too hot, only about 350 degrees Fahrenheit, for the mercury to separate and come off as a gas. And then that gas can be captured and cooled, resulting in liquid mercury. Liquid mercury is put into a flask, and those flasks were sealed and then sent down to the south end of San Francisco Bay, to the area we call and was called El Viso, put on a ship in El Viso and sent up to San Francisco. And from then there put on another ship and sent up to the Sierra Nevada. So this turned El Viso into a very profitable and busy harbor. And if you drive through El Viso today, you will see that there's a sign that says El Viso Incorporated 1852. It was a direct result of the demand for mercury during the gold rush that made El Viso prosperous enough to be incorporated in 1852. Now, the problem with that from our perspective is all that waste that was coming off of the hydraulic mining. All of that water was just disposed of into creeks and rivers in the area. Some of that settlement settled in the rivers, making the rivers shallower, and then they started overflowing. And at the same time, in that latter part of the 19th century, there were farms being established in the Central Valley, and those farms would then get flooded when there were, say, rainstorms, and the rivers could no longer hold the amount of water, and the water spread out. And eventually, this is what put a stop to hydraulic mining. The farmers eventually sued the miners and said, you can't continually destroy our farmland. And a judge agreed and put the end of hydraulic mining in this area in 1884. But the mining had a very big effect. And that was known very early on. And here's a quote from a surveyor in 1862, William Brewer, who said, the amount of soil removed in hydraulic mining must be seen to be appreciated. The refuse fills valleys, while the mud not only muddles the Sacramento River for 400 miles, but it is also slowly and surely filling up San Francisco Bay. So as early as 1862, the damage being caused by this hydraulic mining from the water, not to mention the clearing of the hillsides, and the fact that this water contained mercury, because not all the mercury would form an amalgam. Some of it remained in the water and then came down. And mercury is a very toxic mineral, especially when it's in water. That this was a problem that was noticed in 1862, but nothing was done about it for 22 years. And in addition, because of the destruction of the hillsides, some of that soil and excess mercury is still coming down to us today. And it flows down through the rivers and the northern bays into San Francisco Bay. And it's necessary, therefore, for the bay to be dredged every year so that the ships that today come through San Francisco Bay, carrying cargo to the port of Oakland or taking oil from refineries such as the one in Richmond, can continue to happen. And who pays for that dredging? Not the shipping companies, not the oil companies. The government pays for it, which means you and I pay for it with our taxes. And so the profits were made for the gold mining in the 19th century had costs that are still occurring today, and we are paying for them. To give you an idea of the magnitude of that, the debris just from the gold rush up till 1884 totaled 1.5 billion yards. That's billion, not million. And that is 8 times the amount of earth and stone that was removed for the Panama Canal. So it was an incredible amount, and you can see how much damage, you can imagine how much damage that would have done to all of the area between the Sierra Nevada and down here to San Francisco Bay. Matthew Booker wrote a wonderful history of San Francisco Bay. And what he said was, no human impact on San Francisco Bay has been more extensive or had more dramatic effect than the washing of sediment into the bay by 19th century gold miners. However, that may have been the most dramatic effect, but it was far from the only one. In addition to gold, we had silver, and that has had long-lasting effects on the bay as well. So in 1859, a lode of silver was discovered in the area of Reno, Nevada, and the surrounding areas. And that today is called the Comstock lode, named after one of the discoverers of the silver. And it was noticed pretty on that there was a lot of silver there. And as it turned out, over the history of the silver mining, there was more value of silver in the Comstock lode than there was gold in all of the gold rush. So how did they get the silver out? Well, silver was not hydraulically mined. It was mined in the typical way, as you see in the top picture there, of building tunnels into the ground and chipping out the silver ore and hauling it out for processing. And as I mentioned before, silver also amalgamates with mercury, and it is a way that we can get separate the silver out from its ore. But it needs something else. Gold, which is a very inert metal, exists in the ground in pure form. So you can take that mercury, you can take that gold, even as little particles, and mix it with gold, as was done by the miners. But silver's not that way. It exists as an ore combined with other compounds, and you can't take that ore and just mix it with mercury. You need to have another chemical reaction to separate the silver out of the ore. And that chemical reaction requires chlorine. And where were the miners going to get chlorine? Well, again, they turned to the west into San Francisco Bay, because chlorine is a component of salt, sodium chloride. So this suddenly created a big demand for salt from San Francisco Bay. Now, salt has historically been a very valuable substance. Before the coming of electricity and refrigeration, for many hundreds and perhaps thousands of years, salt was used as a food preservative. And as such, it was very valuable. And the Native Americans in the area learned how to get salt from San Francisco Bay. In some places, there were naturally occurring salt ponds, areas that were filled with salt water during the winter rainy season, but then dried out and left salt in the summer. And they developed other techniques for extracting salt. And when the original settlers came, they too learned to extract salt, which they used to preserve their food. But now here, all of a sudden in the 1860s, there were demands for an incredible amount of salt. And as such, people began creating very huge salt ponds. So they would buy areas of tidal marsh. They would dredge the marsh to make it a little deeper. They would build a levee around it to capture water. They would fill it with bay water and then let the water sit. And over the course of time, that water would evaporate and leave gold to be, to leave salt to be harvested and then sent up to the area of the Comstock lode. So this happened pretty quickly. And by 1868, there were 18 separate salt production companies. And again, tidal marshes were destroyed. So what we're seeing here is the fact that people did not value the tidal marshes for what they were. They valued the tidal marshes only for destroying them, for filling them to create farmland, or to dredge them to create a salt pond, or to dredge them to create a harbor or something like that. So this was the beginning of really extensive destruction of the tidal marshes outside or around San Francisco Bay. So by 1884, both the gold mining, which was stopped by law, and the silver mining, which was phasing out, but there was a lot of other exploitation of the bay happening for the next period of about 80 years. And I'll talk briefly about some of those. The first was oysters and oyster farms. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, oysters were a very popular food, a good and inexpensive source of protein. And it was desired to have oysters grown here in San Francisco Bay. There were native oysters in the bay, but they were not suited for commercial production. They were, they were too small and they grew too slowly. But in 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was built, it became possible to bring oysters from the East Coast to the West Coast. And in fact, that's exactly what happened right away after the railroad was established. Oysters were captured and put in barrels with water, and they would survive the several-day journey across the country. And then those barrels were transported to where the oyster farms were, and the oysters were dumped out. An oyster farm is basically a section of the bay which has been dredged out sufficiently if necessary, and then fenced in so the oysters could remain there while they grow and then are harvested. Now, this water that it came in was not just water and oysters. It was the water from the Atlantic Ocean or from the bays on the East Coast. And it had a lot of other species of animals in it as well. So this began the process of introducing foreign species into San Francisco Bay. And there was another consideration, which is that these Atlantic oysters grew in San Francisco Bay, but they would not reproduce in San Francisco Bay. The water was too cold. So they had to continually import oysters. So for about 50 years or so, from 1869 into the beginning of the 20th century, oysters were just continually imported in the area and grown in San Francisco Bay. By that time, by about 1930, the demand for oysters was decreasing. First of all, because it just sort of went out of favor, as these things do. And secondly, because San Francisco Bay was becoming more and more polluted, and people did not want to eat the product from San Francisco Bay. And we'll talk about that pollution in a minute. So the oyster factories or the oyster farms closed down, and they left some residue, namely 30 million tons of oyster shells. But it didn't go to waste because oyster shells are a component of cement. And so what sprung up in replacement? Cement factories, as you see in the picture in the upper right. So these cement factories could make use of the oyster shells that were in the area, plus the other components, and make cement, which was in great demand because this was an expanding area. And there was a lot of building going on, which needed cement. So kind of replacing the oyster farms were cement factories. And they too eventually passed on, but they were present around the bay. Now let's talk about the salt ponds, and that relates to the map at the lower left. I talked about salt ponds starting in the 1860s, and they provided salt for the silver mining. The mining kind of ended, but the demand for salt continued because salt is a component of many, many industrial processes. You and I mostly think about salt for adding for food, and maybe if you lived in a colder area for spreading on streets to melt the ice, but it's also used in many different manufacturing processes. Salt is, or was at that time, used for gasoline, used for making paper, rubber, glass, steel, and plastics. So there was a continuing demand as the country got more and more industrialized. There was more and more demand for salt. And as you can see in that map, the salt ponds expanded around the southern part of San Francisco Bay. And so the salt ponds were often individually owned, as it was in the 19th century. Somebody would start a salt pond or a few salt ponds, and there were many companies. But during the Depression, the price of salt fell, and these salt businesses struggled. So Leslie Company was formed to buy up all the salt ponds in the San Francisco Bay and gain the economies of scale of having a single company, which could afford more resources. And so that happened. And from 1931 to 1972, Leslie Company owned all those salt ponds. And the salt ponds continued after that. It's just that in 1972, Leslie Company was bought out by Cargill Corporation, which is a big privately owned agricultural company. And Cargill still owns those salt ponds that are present today. Not as many are present today as we'll talk about later, but there still are some, as you saw in that map in the beginning. And finally, in addition to all that production in the area, there was a lot of just plain old bay fill. This was an expanding area, and land was filled in for industry, for housing, for roads, for airports, for whatever use it could be. So between the destruction of the marshes for the oysters or for the salt and the filling of the bay for construction, the bay was shrinking and the tidal marshes were being destroyed. And at its peak, about 85% of all the tidal marshes around the bay were destroyed for one reason or another. And this is why species that lived in the marsh were very common in the early 19th century and before then, now were becoming much more scarce. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. The next phase, in addition to all of that exploitation, was the path of pollution. And the bay was always used as a dumping ground. And why not? When the settlers first came here, they could toss their garbage into the bay and their sewage into the bay. And twice a day, nature would come in with water and then take all that stuff back out and eventually take it out to the Pacific Ocean. So what could be better than that? Well, that worked in a sense when there were not very many people here. But as the area became more and more populated in the 19th century and then the 20th century, these practices continued. And by the 1940s and 1950s, this was too much for the bay to get rid of. And the bay just essentially became a dump. It became a cesspool. It was full of garbage and it was full of sewage. And to give you an example again of the magnitude of these things, in 1960, 250 million gallons of sewage per day were being dumped in the bay. And to allow you to kind of process how much that is, think about Levi Stadium, which you've probably seen on TV if you haven't seen it in person, even from the outside. And you know that it's a huge stadium. So imagine filling that up 8 times with this sewage and garbage and dumping that into the bay every day. So that was the situation of San Francisco Bay in 1960. And in part because the bay was such a disaster, there were actually plans to destroy the bay. And that's the path of destruction, which I will talk about now, and which we know sort of that this didn't happen. These plans that I'm going to talk about, very fortunately, didn't happen. But it's instructive to learn about them and see what people were really thinking about. The first of these plans was known as the Reber Plan. It's shown on the left. It's named after its inventor and main proponent, John Reber, who was a self-taught engineer and a very good promoter, and someone who believed in that philosophy of natural lands like marshes and bays are better suited to be destroyed for more productive purposes. So he came up with a proposal, which is outlined on this card. The card dates from later than 1929, but the proposal was essentially the same. And this proposal was going to serve two purposes. First of all, it was going to solve the problem of automobile traffic. Now, those of you who in recent times have sat bumper to bumper on our freeways or on our bridges may scoff at the fact that the people in the 1920s thought that they had a traffic problem. But think about that. San Francisco was a growing city and there were no bridges to get to San Francisco. If you didn't come up from the peninsula, you wound up taking a ferry. And that made the commute very slow. And the cars were slow and the roads were not in good condition. So that made traffic a problem. The other problem that he was trying to solve was fresh water. And again, is a problem we still have today. But even back then, they were concerned with having enough fresh water, both for the Bay Area and for other growing parts of California. So here was his plan. He was going to have constructed two dams. One dam here across the northern part of San Francisco Bay, roughly where today's San Rafael Richmond Bridge is. And one down here in the South Bay, sort of from San Francisco to Oakland. And the top dam would create a freshwater lake north of this dam. So the water in what is the northern part of San Francisco Bay and San Pablo Bay and Sassoon Bay would be all fresh water. And in the South Bay, he would channel some of this fresh water down this canal that would be constructed bisecting the East Bay. And this water would come down to the lake created by the dam, the southern dam on the bay. And that would also collect fresh water. And there would be so much water here that there would be water for the Bay Area, water that could be piped to other areas of California. And he pictures this very idyllic by showing that these lakes could be used for recreation with sailboats and swimming. And here's a fish for fishing up in the northern one. So this was his ideal. And then in the center would be salt water, pure Pacific Ocean water. And this would be an industrial area and ships would come in and there would be a lot of industry in this area as part of the growth of the area. So he proposed this plan in 1929, but then came the Depression and then came World War II. So nothing much happened for 15 or 16 years. But then the war ended and he helped resurrect this plan and modify it a little bit. And he felt that this was even more necessary after World War II because we would need the industrial production and we would need military bases in the area. And we would need transportation because there was a fear of an atomic bomb and people might have to evacuate the peninsula. And so they could use this dam, the southern dam, which would have roads on the top of it. And the dam he proposed at this point would be 2,000 feet wide and have 32 lanes of traffic on it. Now that is huge. I have driven down in Los Angeles area where at some points where freeways meet, there's as much as 7 or 8 lanes of traffic in each direction for short stretches. And that boggles my mind. And so the concept of having twice that width of traffic is almost inconceivable. Plus, there would be railroad tracks there as well. The northern dam would also hold traffic, but it wouldn't be as wide, partly because Marin County was not extensively settled at that time. And so there was not the perceived need for that much traffic. So this was the Reber plan. And as crazy as it seems to us today, it did get a lot of support. And it was actually seriously considered by Congress. And that's a story that I will tell in a few minutes. But first I want to tell about another plan at the time. And I call this the San Bruno Mountain Plan. And that was a plan for San Mateo County that wanted to expand its land area by filling in its portion of San Francisco Bay and creating 23 square miles of new land area that could be built on and have roads and all this sort of stuff. The 23 square miles is about half the size of San Francisco. So they were going to fill a huge chunk of the bay. That would require a lot of dirt. And where would they get this dirt? From the top of San Bruno Mountain. So in the picture is a contemporary picture of San Bruno Mountain, which exists just to the south of San Francisco. San Francisco is to the right of the mountain in this picture. And they were going to literally scrape the dirt off the top of this mountain, destroying the environment on the mountain, of course. And they were going to construct a conveyor belt down the east side of the mountain, probably right about here. And so the trucks would scrape this dirt off and come to the east end of the mountaintop, dump the dirt on the conveyor, which would go down the belt and wind up in San Francisco Bay. Again, almost inconceivable to us today, but it was seriously considered. As I mentioned before, though, that obviously neither of these plans succeeded. So what happened? Well, the mindset of people and that mindset that natural areas such as the bay and the marshes are only good for being developed for profit making, that whole idea started changing after World War II. And the idea that we need to preserve our environment became more popular. That was, however, happening slowly. But I do call that from 1960, when things really started picking up, our path of protection and restoration. So as far as San Francisco Bay, that really started in 1960 and 61 with these 3 women that are shown here. They were Kay Kerr, Sylvia McLaughlin, and Esther Gulick. They lived in Berkeley. They were the wives of important people in the University of California. Kay Kerr's husband was the president of the university, the whole university system, and he was located in Berkeley. And these women were very disturbed at what they saw happening to San Francisco Bay. They were living in the hills above Berkeley, and they could look down, and they were literally watching the bay get filled in. In addition, Kay sometimes had the job of driving to San Francisco Airport and picking up someone who was coming to visit the university and meet with her husband. And she would have to drive them over this San Francisco Bay that stank and was full of garbage. And she would literally have to apologize for the sad condition of the bay. So they got together and they said, they were friends that used to get together periodically. And they said, we really need to do something. Well, because of their husband's importance, they knew a lot of people. And so what happened was in 1961, they got in touch with the leaders of what today we would call environmental organizations, the Sierra Club, the Save the Redwoods League, the Wilderness Society. These all had existed for a long time. And they brought the leaders to a meeting. And we know what happened in this meeting because there was a reporter there who documented it. And the women asked these men to add San Francisco Bay to their area of concern and start working on preserving San Francisco Bay and cleaning it up. And the men said, universally, all of them said, well, we're too busy with our redwood trees and our wilderness and so on. And the bay is pretty much a lost cause already. It's in really terrible condition. So we don't think we can do anything about that. But if you, referring to the women, wanted to do something about it, we would be glad to support you, and we'll give you our membership lists because there was no privacy regulation at that time. And we wish you good luck. So the women, those three women, took it as a challenge, and they started to form their own organization, which they called the Save San Francisco Bay Association. And it still exists today. And it's got a shorter name. It's now simply called Save the Bay. And so they started crystallizing public opinion and directing it. So as I said, there was already kind of a rising movement to understand that the environment was important and we shouldn't just destroy natural areas on a whim. And they focused this, and they got their supporters to go to city council meetings and county board of supervisor meetings. And they bussed their supporters to Sacramento. And they got popular radio announcers to advocate for them. And this began to change the situation and began to have results in the legislature. But before I get to that, let me step back to the Reber plan because I want to kind of do this chronologically. And so the Reber plan, as I said, was brought back after World War II. And there was so much support for it that Congress got interested in it. And they actually set aside some funds for the Army Corps of Engineering to study the plan and see if it was feasible. And they did that in 1950. And the Army Corps decided that the way they would do that is to build a scale model of the bay. And then they could model creating those dams and see how the water flow would work and see if this whole thing was successful. So it took them 7 years to mostly to study the bay and take measurements so they could replicate it. And then they built a model in Sausalito in a warehouse that had been used for shipbuilding, but then was abandoned after the war. And they took 6 more years to do the study. And the end result in 1963 is summarized by these few words from the study. The Reber plan was infeasible by any frame of reference. That was the end of that. I mean, basically what they found out was the bay is too shallow, and they assumed that nobody was going to really start dredging extensive portions of the bay. And not enough fresh water was coming in from the Sierra Nevada to fill those lakes. And in addition, this would, of course, destroy the estuary. You saw on that card that the salt water and the fresh water would be totally separate by those dams. So no more estuary. The environment would be totally destroyed. And there was a lot of change between 1950 and 1963. So sentiment was turning against the River Plan, and this just put it to bed. So this kind of development was halted. The good news is that the Bay model still exists. It continued to be used for modeling until 2000. It then became obsolete because you could do this modeling faster and better on a computer. But the Army Corps of Engineers maintained this model and turned it into an education center. And they have a nonprofit organization that runs it. So this model exists on the shoreline north in Sausalito, north of the city, on the Bridgeway. The model continues to work. You can go in there and see the tides flowing. And there are a number of exhibits and kiosks and short videos that talk about the bay and the environment of the bay and the River Plan that was the impetus for creating the Bay model. And it's a very worthwhile place to visit. So I recommend you do that. We'll put its website link in the chat. And if you have never been there, I suggest you put it on your to-do list. So meanwhile, back to Saving the Bay and that organization, they actually got the legislature to start working fairly quickly. The legislature did some studies and they came out with passing the McAteer-Petras Act in 1965. And this act established the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, known as the BCDC. So it was established on a temporary basis in 1965, and it was made permanent by an amendment to the law in 1969. And the commission was in charge of regulating the dumping into the bay and the discharge of sewage into the bay, all of which were essentially prohibited, and filling the bay, which could be only done by approval of the commission. So all these plans pretty much came to a screeching halt in the early 1960s, and then that was codified later in the 1960s. They also began to think about increasing access to the shoreline of the bay, much of which had been restricted by industrial development and things, preventing people from even getting to the bay. And they started thinking about restoration of some of the tidal marshes that were destroyed. Another major act that had an effect on the bay was the California Environmental Quality Act of 1970, which required that any project in the state be evaluated for environmental impact. So this was for the whole state, but it included in San Francisco Bay. So anybody who had a project needed to consider and write down the environmental impact so it could be evaluated. And indeed, this act is still in effect today, and projects throughout the state today still have a section on their effects on the environment. So the bay seemed to be under regulation, but there were still problems. Those salt ponds were technically not part of the bay. They were privately owned. They were not under state jurisdiction. They were actually under local jurisdiction, just like the land maybe adjacent to the bay, local jurisdiction, local zoning. And it was possible that these local jurisdictions could decide to develop the areas that were salt ponds that became available. In fact, in 1959, there was a plan to create an extensive water recreation area in the South Bay where some of those salt ponds existed. However, again, there were some people who decided they needed to act. And the primary person to do that was Arthur Ogilvie. He was a planner for the county of San Francisco, and he was an ardent preservationist. And he figured that if local jurisdictions weren't good enough and the state didn't have jurisdiction, the only alternative was the federal government. And at that time, the federal government was becoming much more predisposed to preserving the environment. So he came up with a plan of making the South Bay, or parts of the salt ponds of South Bay, into a national wildlife refuge, which would preserve them in perpetuity. And as he began working on this plan, he worked with the Department of the Interior and the Fish and Wildlife Service and got some encouragement from them. And he went out and he literally advertised in the newspaper for people to come help him. And one of the people who responded to that ad is the woman shown there, Florence LaRiviere. She was a citizen, not a government executive, much like the three women we talked about earlier. And she had already been working on preservation. She worked with the city of Palo Alto, which had had plans to develop its marshland area and turn it into a hotel and all sorts of things. And she convinced Palo Alto to not do that and to preserve the marshlands. And indeed, that's what happened, and they are still preserved today. So then she joined with Art Ogilvie and other people, and they began to work on a plan for a national wildlife refuge. And indeed, they came forward with the plan and they talked to the Department of the Interior, who endorsed the plans and said, this would be great. Our goals are wildlife habitat, open space, and recreation and education, which have been the goals of the Fish and Wildlife Service all along, as I explained earlier. So they went to Congressman Don Edwards, who was one of the congressmen from San Jose, and got him to write the bill and sponsor it through Congress, and got President Nixon to sign it. And the refuge was created in 1972, nearly 50 years ago from today. So it was the first of the refuges in the Bay Area. Those other 6 that I showed you earlier were created later. And it was one of the first in an urban area. So that was sort of groundbreaking as well. And these people who helped form the refuge have been memorialized. There is an island in Coyote Creek near where it enters San Francisco Bay that is now named Ogilvie Island. And there's a restored marsh in the refuge in Fremont, which is named the La Riviere Marsh, after Florence and her husband, who also worked with her on the restoration. And Don Edwards' name was added to the refuge. So originally it was just the San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge, and now it has Don Edwards' name in that. So I want to mention one more event, which is important for saving the bay, and then we'll talk about restoration. So in 1989, Baykeeper was formed. This was an organization that concentrates solely on polluting the bay and the health of the bay, not so much on bay fill and other matters. So they have a boat with which they patrol the bay. They have a drone which can go over the bay and look for pollution. They have volunteers who work with them, who call in when they see pollution. And Baykeeper, which has an extensive legal staff, will go to this polluter and say, you know, this is illegal, needs to stop. And if they can get a settlement with the polluter, fine. And if they can't, they take the polluter to court. And as you see here, they've had 280 legal victories over their history, probably more now. And that, of course, doesn't include all the out-of-court settlements. And some of those victories were even with branches such as the military of the United States, who were in the area and who were polluting the bay. And another example that they have on their website is in the 1990s, they caught a dredging company which was dumping polluted water into the bay in the middle of the night. So they had some of their volunteers go out in kayaks and photograph this activity. And then they took the CEO of this company to court and they won a victory, which was the first time a CEO was convicted of environmental crimes against San Francisco Bay. And they are still doing this today. And we'll have links to both Save the Bay and to Baykeeper for you to go to their website and find out more about what it is that they do. So now, after talking about protection, let's talk about restoration. So in 2003, there was some agreement with Cargill Corporation, which was reducing the amount of salt ponds in the area. And an agreement was made with the help of Senator Feinstein that 15,000 acres of former salt pond could be transferred to the refuge. And some of these, the salt farming rights were retained by Cargill, as you saw in the map in the beginning. So some of them are still salt ponds, but the underlying area belongs to the refuge. And whenever Cargill decides to give those up, then that land is protected immediately. And some of those lands were turned over to the refuge for restoration. And you can see by the map that the first phase was completed and additional phases are in planning and in progress even today. And this was and is the largest wetlands restoration project on the West Coast, and the second largest in the United States, the larger one being in the Florida Keys. But now there is yet another project, a newer project, which is called the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline Project. So it's not solely restoration of marshes. In fact, its primary motivation is protection from flooding by enhancing the levees in the area. But as a secondary effect of this, they will do marshland restoration. So the primary goal is the flooding of El Viso to protect 6,000 residents plus anybody else who is in the area temporarily. And there are two facilities, the Santa Clara San Jose Regional Wastewater Facility, which is in the area, and the Silicon Valley Advanced Water Purification Center. So those are the facilities that clean up most of the water from the San Francisco, from the Santa Clara Valley, and clean up that water before it is emptied out into the bay. And I say most because there are a few other plants, such as the city of Sunnyvale, that cleans up water. So all of the water is being cleaned before it gets put into San Francisco Bay. But if these facilities were damaged and leaks came in, a lot of that sewage could flow into the bay. So it's important to protect them as well as to protect the inhabited areas of Alviso. And finally, it's also going to restore nearly 3,000 acres of tidal marshes. And I'll show you that on the map and on the next slide. And it's going to help provide access to those restored areas by having some structures like benches and lookout and bridges to facilitate getting around. And it's also going to add connections to the San Francisco Bay Trail. So let me quickly mention that the Bay Trail is a project of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And it is the goal to have a walkable, bikeable trail all around San Francisco Bay. At the moment, there are 350 miles of that trail and about another 150 miles to go. So this project will help make this refuge land kind of part of the Bay Trail and access to the Bay Trail as well. So this project is being done by the Army Corps of Engineers in concert with, of course, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Santa Clara Valley Water District, and the California State Coastal Conservancy. And part of the funding for this is part of a larger protection and restoration tax that was approved by the voters in 2000 and again in 2012 and again in 2020 by over 75% of the voters. This is not a huge tax, but taxes are always sensitive subjects. So I'm very pleased that all of us collectively in the area are supporting this restoration and protection project and other similar projects and are willing to pay for part of it. This particular project is a 3-year project. After several years of delay, it just got off the ground recently. So some of the trails in the area of Alviso will be closed, as I mentioned earlier. So here's a map of the area. The portion of the refuge that I mentioned, the facility that we have, the Environmental Education Center is here. And what this red line is existing levees that are going to be enhanced and made taller and stronger to protect against sea level rise. And here on the other side of the levees are Alviso and those water processing plants that I talked about. So those trails that I showed you earlier, 8, 9, and 10, those are in this area. And the new Chicago Marsh and the areas of former salt ponds A16 and A17 have already been restored, which is why there are trails in the area, and they are part of the refuge. And the A in their numbering is A for Alviso. And the other area, which is to the west, are salt ponds that are part of the refuge, but they've not been restored or developed, and there's very little access to them. So now they're going to be restored. They're going to be open to the bay water directly, so they'll be tidal, and there'll be some paths and infrastructure there, so they are much easier to visit. And this area to the east, A18, is another former salt pond, which is now owned by the city of San Jose, and it too will be restored to be an actual tidal marsh. So I went over to Alviso a couple of weeks ago to take a look at the beginning of construction. And here's a couple of pictures. This is part of that levee that you saw with the red line. And there's some new dirt here, which is part of the increasing of the levee. Now, this was at lunchtime. There wasn't much activity going on, but I did spot the supervisor who is checking out the area. and making sure that everything was being done correctly. So we've gone through all this history, we've gone through the destruction and despoilment, and now we've gone through protection and restoration. So who has been rescued by this refuge and all these efforts? Well, one is the endangered species that I have talked about, and now I will talk about in some detail. Here are pictures of two of the endangered species in Don Edwards and also live elsewhere around the bay. One is a bird called the California ridgeways rail, which used to be called the California clapper rail, a name you may be familiar with. So the birds that were collectively called clapper rails were investigated by an ornithologist named Robert Ridgway. And he decided that these were really three separate species of birds that deserved their own names. Well, he passed away not long thereafter. And when whoever it is that assigns names decided to create three names, they named one of the birds after him. And that's the bird that we have here at the refuge. So we have the California ridgeways rail. Now this bird, which is about the size of a chicken, as you can see is somewhat plump, was very common in the days before the destruction of the tidal marshes. In fact, this bird was hunted along with ducks and geese in the late 19th century. And there was a report that in 1 week in the 1880s, there were 5,000 of these birds shot for food. So it gives you an indication of how prevalent they were in the area. How many of these birds there are today? The last estimate published by the Fish and Wildlife Service, there are 1,200 adults roughly in existence today. So there were so many that 5,000 in a week could be shot. And now there are 1,200. And that's an improvement because 15 years ago, they were only estimated to be 750. So they are recovering. I'll talk a little bit more about this bird. It can fly, but it doesn't tend to do so. It lives in the tall grasses in the marshland. And if it's threatened, it tends to run rather than fly, which made it easier to be shot. Also, the name rail for this whole family of birds, there are quite a lot of species of rail, has nothing to do with a rail that is a long, thin object like a handrail or a railroad rail. Instead, it comes from another meaning of the word rail, the verb that when somebody rails against something, they make a lot of noise. And this bird has a loud call, and the call is sometimes said to sound like a clap. So this was called the clapper rail. The other endangered animal is this mouse, which is called the salt marsh harvest mouse. It also lives in the marshland. It lives in a plant called pickleweed, which is what you see to its left. It's a succulent plant, and it grows in salt water, as the marsh plants must do. But all these plants have to get rid of the salt because, like any living being, it needs fresh water. So what it does with the salt is it separates the salt out of the water and sends the salt up to the tips of the plant, where eventually it turns red, as you see there. And then those tips will die off and drop off, sending the salt back to the marsh. So the mouse lives in pickleweed. It can eat pickleweed as one of its foods. It is a small mouse. You may remember from that slide I showed you. It's only about as big as an adult thumb, not counting its tail. Its tail is actually longer than its body. And the reason for that is this mouse has been adapted to learn to swim. It is a nocturnal animal, but regardless of when it is sleeping, it might be in an area in the marsh that then gets flooded when high tide comes in. So it must swim to higher land, and it can do that, and it uses its tail as a rudder. The mouse has also been adapted to drink and use salt water. It has specialized kidneys that will process the salt out of the water, something that you and I can't do, and very few, if any, other animals can do. But this mouse can do that. So it's a very special mouse, and it exists only around San Francisco Bay and San Pablo Bay. And the Wildlife Service doesn't have a good total estimate of the number that are around today. They're certainly less than they were when the marshes were full. Another issue with the mouse is that its lifetime is only 9 months. So it must mature, find a mate, and reproduce all in the course of 9 months. And of course, with fewer of the mice around, it's harder and harder to find a mate. Somehow it is obviously being successful because they're still around, and hopefully their numbers are increasing. So these two endangered species, and there are some others as well, were one of the main motivators for creating Don Edwards, and one of the arguments that Art Ogilvy used in his plan to create the refuge. So we have rescued those endangered species, which might well have gone extinct if we probably would have certainly gone extinct if the Reber plan had been implemented, because there would be no marshland at all. We've also rescued many other birds, not that they're endangered, but they need habitat to survive. And the San Francisco Bay area and the marshes provide a place. So here's another picture of birds at the bay. These small birds are blackneck stilts. They have a black head and neck and wings, and they have very long and pink legs. You probably can't make that out, but you may see from those one in the back, those birds in the back, that their legs are very long. In fact, they have the longest leg to body ratio of any bird. It was thought that they were second to the flamingo, but apparently recently it was determined that these are the winners. So these are some very special birds. And as you can see, there are quite a lot of them at the refuge. And there are some more pelicans over there on the right. And in addition to all this wildlife, the refuge has rescued us. It's rescued us from our own excesses, like the Reber plan, from nature's messes, like the floods in Alviso that are shown there, and from urban stresses by providing us an area of recreation so close to our urban area. So that's when I say refuge to the rescue. It has rescued all of us, and it has rescued the environment as well. So now I would like to mention that if you would like to find out more about the refuge and our environment, this coming Saturday, we're having a program called the Bio Blitz. And it's a family-oriented program. It takes place in our Alviso Center. It is totally free. It will be completely outdoors, and there will be appropriate pandemic considerations as well. So we will be glad to talk more about this after I finish my presentation in just a couple of minutes. Olivia can talk more about it if you have some questions, and I hope that some of you will be able to join us. And I want to kind of close with the fact that even though we have all that protection, and even though we're doing all that restoration, the job is not done. And as Kay Kerr said, the job will be never done because the bay is never saved. So I will just mention quickly some of the threats to the bay, some of the problems that still exist. Pesticide runoff that comes from the Central Valley and comes through into San Francisco Bay. Illegal dumping, like the example that I talked about earlier. Refuse that comes in from the street. Our sewage systems, in many cases, our municipal sewage systems are getting old and they develop leaks. That's something that Baykeeper has been very vigilant about. Mining waste, mercury is still coming down from the Sierra Nevada, and garbage dumps, which have been discontinued, but are around the edge of the bay. Some of that garbage can make its way into the bay. Rising sea level, and we talked about how the restoration project is attempting to deal with that. Oil spills in the central part of the bay have happened several times and certainly could happen again. And there are occasionally proposals for dredging the bay and allowing even bigger oil tankers to come into the bay. Bay fill and development could potentially be approved by the BCDC, and whether or not we as preservationists think it's a good idea. So that's continually a threat. There isn't a ban on development of the bay, just regulation of it. So that doesn't prohibit it. And finally, there's the whole issue of freshwater diversion from the Delta, which is deserving of a presentation all on its own. But just very briefly, the fresh water from the Sierra Nevada, a lot of it passes through a marsh area near Sacramento, which is called the Delta. And then normally it continues out to the west and flows down to the bays in this area. But for almost a century, we have been diverting some of that water and sending it to the farms in the Central Valley and to the masses of people in Southern California. And at this point, about 50% of the water that would be flowing into San Francisco Bay is being diverted. And there are plans for more. So we're already changing the nature of this estuary by changing the balance between saltwater and freshwater. And there's a possibility that could happen even more. So that's another thing to be aware of. So now I will close with a very brief personal statement and a little bit about why I do a presentation like this. So I came to this area from the East Coast in the early 1970s as a young man. And I went to school here and I had a career here and I raised a family here. And by the time I got here, San Francisco Bay, as I mentioned, was pretty much already cleaned up. It didn't stink. There were no visible garbage in it. And so all my time here, I just took it for granted. I mean, here was this big, beautiful bay, and I drove by it, and I drove over it, and occasionally I would be on it in a boat ride or a ferry ride. And I never gave much thought to its existence. And then after I retired from my career, and I came to Don Edwards as a volunteer, and I started learning about the history of the bay. And I learned what I have now told you tonight, and more than that. I have come to really appreciate the bay, the fact that it's still here, it was not destroyed, the fact that there were and are people working to protect it and to restore it. And honestly, that thought comes to my mind every time I see the bay. And it may not be so frequently for you, but what I hope will happen is when you see the bay, however you are approaching it or going over it, and whenever you have an opportunity to enjoy the bay by hiking or biking at the Refuge or some other area along the shore, or bird watching, or going out on a boat, take the time to remember what happened to the bay and what didn't happen to bay and what could still happen to the bay in the future. And then you will have an appreciation of what the bay is and what it does for us. And another way of saying that is to go back to the way I presented the history. There are many paths available in the future, and you can help choose the right one. So I thank you very much for joining us for this program this evening. I hope it has been enjoyable and educational. And Olivia and I now will be glad to answer any questions that were in the chat, or you may go ahead and put them there now.